Good morning, Wisconsin. So let's pour that coffee and talk to some experts about what's going on in Milwaukee, Madison, Washington, and beyond. Broadcasting live from the Annex Wealth Management Studios at the Avenue in beautiful downtown Milwaukee. It's the Political Power Hour on WTMJ. Here's your host, Steve Scafidi.
Should we talk about the government?
The answer to that question is always yes, but it's how you talk about it that matters. And we got a good one today. Rick Esenberg, president of the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, in studio, not more than 6 feet away from me. Rick Esenberg, happy Halloween.
Well, happy Halloween to you.
Neither one of us in costume. We don't need that.
Well, some people think I'm always in costume.
Oh, is that what it is?
Yeah.
You're actually well dressed. You got a something big to go to?
Yeah, I've got to give a talk at Marquette Law School at noon, so I'm suited up.
My nephew Mitch will be listening to that probably. So.
He's the one who arranged it.
Yeah. Wow. How about that? Awesome. All right. So there's like a million things we could talk about, but I want to go back a little bit because all of us who do what I do, and certainly you who do what you do, and your great organization, Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, remember 2020, but you actually did more than just talk about it. You did a lot of research and invested a lot of time and research into what happened in 2020. Let's sort of have a quick overview of what happened in 2020 and some of the recommendations that you made that, frankly, were never, well, the legislature tried. Governor said no. Is that a correct assessment?
Yeah. So we did a report on the 2020 election in Wisconsin. It took us most of 2021 to do it. We had 6 or 7 people working on it. We used a political consultant. We used our research director, Will Flanders, has a PhD in political science, and we came to 2 conclusions. The first conclusion was that based on what we could see, Joe Biden got more eligible votes than Donald Trump. Right? So
he won the election.
The election was not stolen. We could find no evidence that it was. On the other hand, we found that the election was also not as secure as it could be. There were a number of areas in which WEC and clerks had departed from the law, particularly with respect to the receipt of absentee ballots.
Wisconsin Elections Commission, for those folks.
Yes, Wisconsin Election Commission. And this made the election less secure than it ought to be under statute, and certainly could be by good practice. Now, that doesn't mean it was stolen. It just means that we can do better. Now, the reason that we concluded that it wasn't stolen, notwithstanding the fact that there were these departures from proper procedure, which, you know, in fairness, were motivated at least in part by COVID, is that I think most elections are beyond the margin of fraud. Insofar as if you're going to do fraud at scale, right, enough fraudulent votes that would turn even a close election like Wisconsin in 2020, you have to involve a lot of people, and you probably wouldn't be able to do it without creating detectable anomalies, right? There would be surges of votes that aren't supposed to be where you find them. We looked for that stuff. We used heat maps. We compared patterns of voting. We conducted opinion polls to see whether what people told us about what they did matched what the election results were. It was a fairly extensive report. The Wall Street Journal, my development director compels me to say every time I talk about this, that the Wall Street Journal editorial board called it the best report on the 2020 election that had been done.
I would agree with them. I read most of it. It's as thorough as you're going to get on that race.
And we just did not find evidence that the election was stolen. We did make recommendations. We made recommendations. It is our view, and of course we later won a case, which has now been reversed, establishing that drop boxes were not permitted under Wisconsin law. But our position was we didn't think drop boxes were needed. I still don't think they're needed. But if you're going to have them, what you needed to do is you needed to establish a set of rules. We have no rules governing the use of drop boxes now. I think that's because the statutes don't provide for them. But we needed to have some rules that address things like, 24-hour surveillance, security, chain of custody, who emptied the drop boxes and when. But that didn't happen. Wisconsin doesn't maintain its voter rolls very well. Wisconsin isn't unusual in that regard. Most states don't do that.
Well, it's a moving object. It's always moving around.
Right, it's a moving object, but they're very reluctant to address the question of people that have moved. They don't follow up on mismatches between the voter records and Department of Motor Vehicle records. A lot of those are clerical errors, but there are also quite a bit of them. And you don't want a situation where you have a lot of incorrect names on the voter rolls, because that, again, it would be difficult to do it at scale, but that does provide the opportunity for fraud.
Rick Esenberg joining us from the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. Lots to talk about. If you have a question for Rick or yours truly, just fire it off, 855-616-1620. After the break, on the subject of sort of deviating from what were the rules of engagement for an election in Wisconsin at the time in 2020, I'll ask my friend and my guest, Rick Esenberg, if there was any if he thinks there's any willful deviations that were trying to trick the system. We'll ask that question after this on 620 WTMJ. Rick Esenberg, our guest. We're talking about the election in 2020. We're going to sort of transition to what's coming next. But I asked you before the break, in 2020, any evidence, any suggestion that clerks or election officials were deliberately trying to, I don't want to say game the system to try to get an advantage for Democrats or Joe Biden or any candidate?
I don't like to cast aspersions on anybody's motivations, and we didn't really look at that. I think that there are some real problems. For example, one of the things that we hear about is that WEC authorized departure from the use of special voting deputies to take absentee ballots in nursing homes. That's clearly against the law. I mean, the law gave it makes the use of that system mandatory. But
my lawyer friends will tell me on the text line in about 5 seconds, but they couldn't go into those facilities because of COVID.
They don't have to tell you that, because that was the very next thing I was going to say. So they didn't follow the law, but on the other hand, I don't know that it was something nefarious. I think that they were trying to deal with a very difficult situation where, you didn't want people to go into nursing homes at the height of the pandemic. And this is one of the reasons why when it happened, and this wasn't in secret, everybody knew that this was happening, and neither the Democrats or the Republicans objected to that. And I can understand why they would. Nobody wanted to be seen as, the person that insisted that somebody has to go into a nursing home and possibly kill grandma. And so I think that the difference between on this issue of election integrity is largely one of ideology. I mean, I think that there are a lot of Republicans who are absolutely convinced that there's widespread voter fraud. They sincerely believe it.
Oh, yeah.
They are, for the most part, wrong, right? Most of the stories I hear don't check out, but they believe it sincerely. The Democrats, on the other hand, believe that efforts at election integrity are often, in reality, voter suppression. They are also wrong, but I have to assume that they sincerely believe it. The irony of all of this is that because of the changing alignments of the parties, Republicans are probably now the one to benefit from high turnout, because an important part of their vote are people who are inconsistent and irregular voters now. That wasn't the case in the past. It seems to be the case in 2024.
Real quick, recommendations that you made that the legislature passed, but the governor didn't sign off on. Give me a couple of them.
Well, there was the business about the drop box. There was to address the question of maintaining the voter list. We wanted to have a more explicit prohibition. I don't think it's legal under current law, but we wanted to have a more explicit prohibition of ballot harvesting. I don't mean your wife taking your ballot into City Hall and dropping it off, but I mean having paid political operatives
collecting hundreds of ballots,
collect ballots, and then either returning them or not returning them. As I always say, that is an occasion of political sin.
I want to take another quick break here. Rick Esenberg, Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, the president of that organization. After the break, will there be lawyers? And if you want to go back to Shakespeare, which I did on Twitter today, should we kill all the lawyers because of all of that nonsense? Rick is shaking his head. That's the right answer. We'll get to all of that and more right here on 620 WTMJ.
Send lawyers, guns, and money.
Producer Jasmine.
Get me out of this.
Perfect. Transition to our next topic. We got about 4 minutes here before the bottom of the hour news. For you young people, that's 9:30. Rick Esenberg, president of the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, joining the conversation today in studio. All right, so I keep hearing there's going to be a lot of lawyers involved in the sort of election day activities and certainly post. And I know from talking to some of these folks who are involved for the campaigns, they're already hired, they're ready to go depending on what happens. Do you think there will be a lot of lawyer questions, a lot of legal questions swirling around this race like there was in 2020?
Well, first of all, I feel compelled to say that line, let's kill all the liars, that was spoken by a villain in that play, right? I mean, that was not a good thing. That was a bad thing.
And the whole line is, let's do this first. Let's kill all the lawyers.
Yes. But of course there'll be lawyers. This is the United States of America.
Yes.
There are always lawyers. And I think that, whether those lawyers do a lot will depend on what the results look like. I don't do this kind of thing anymore. And our organization doesn't do it because that's a partisan activity. It's for or against a candidate for public office, and we just don't do that. But I do remember years ago, I was in the war room for the Republican Party. And I remember that, we got to about 9 o'clock, and we wanted to know if it had been a great night for Republicans. We wanted to know if the Democrats were going to do something, because if they weren't going to do something, if they weren't going to run into court, then we could all go out and we could have drinks and celebrate the result. And, we called over to, the Democrat war room, and they said, nah, we lost. It's fair and square. And it's hard to imagine that happening today.
It's not going to happen that way.
And so, I think that there will be, if the election is close, there will be efforts to find something to litigate. But the important thing to note is that because of, in particular, a U.S. Supreme Court decision called Moore versus Harper, which had to do with the independent state legislature theory, and reform to the Electoral Count Act, the theory that the Trump forces were trying to rely on, the scenario that they were trying to play out, which incidentally I don't think involved January 6th riots at all, it won't work. It's quite clear now that the vice president does not have the authority to reject electoral votes. Objections have to get not just one objection, but 20% of the members of both houses. I just don't think that's going to happen. But there still could be, in very, very close states, litigation, but it would have to be predicated on something that happened on the ground that we haven't yet seen.
The one that I hear about, again, away from the show, because I don't spend a lot of time talking about this stuff, except on the Thursday edition of the show, is that part of this election observer process is we have a lot more people hyper-focused on looking for things that look irregular or out of the norm. That's where some of this stuff might come from.
Yeah, and I think you're going to have it on both sides there. You're going to have election observers. They're going to be, although, we've always had election observers. 20 years ago, I was at a polling place in Milwaukee, and at one point at that one little election place, we had a dream team of 8 different lawyers who were in that polling place, and none of them contributed anything of any significance whatsoever, including me. But I think that there's that, and then there's this kind of election official protection team, and there's going to be disputes over what observers can see and not see, and I suspect we'll see some of that on election night.
I think
and
you're
into
right.
the morning.
Rick Esenberg, you sticking around for the next half hour. If you have a question, just shoot it our way. You'll love this before we get to the news here. Of course, we shouldn't kill, all caps, all the lawyers from the text line. I love my texters. All right, so Rick Esenberg is here. We can certainly answer a legal question related to the election or sort of looking back to 2020. We have local news, lots of good stuff today. And obviously, if you have not gone out and vote or you're planning on, get out there, get your vote cast. Tuesday will be fine as well, but be prepared. It's going to be busy. A lot of people voting this election.
Clap for the Wolfman. He gon' reach your record high.
Oh, having fun on a Thursday edition. I keep saying it, get out and vote. No excuses this time. Joining us in studio, Rick Esenberg, president of the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. So you and I have talked a lot of politics over the years, and I guess this is a question that it seems so obvious that I actually know the answer, but I still want to ask you. Do conservatives, actual conservatives on policy, not whatever name people attach to that title, are there any conservatives in this race?
Well, let me like two qualifications. First of all, if we're talking about American conservatism as it's existed since about 1960, as opposed to, say, Hungarian conservatism.
No.
And if we're talking about a candidate who conservatives can think is actually a positive force for the advancement of their ideas as opposed to the lesser of two evils, the answer is clearly no. I said in 2016 during the general election that this year my team did not make the playoffs. Unfortunately, now we've become the Pittsburgh Pirates of presidential politics. We haven't, made it for a while now. Look, if I think Trump has some conservative instincts. I think in his first race and first term, he cut some deals with conservatives in order to retain their support. It's not clear that he's doing that this time around. But if you're looking for somebody who is a champion of fiscal responsibility, limited government, American constitutionalism, and, engagement abroad, responsible engagement abroad, that's not Donald Trump. That was Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
It's not Donald Trump. And, I don't know, if you've gone and, seen the Reagan movie, it's obviously hagiographic. It's very favorable towards Reagan. But if you watch that and then you kind of compare it with what we have today in the Republican Party, the contrast is stark.
We could go crazy just trying to figure out what Trump's platform is, but from the sense of traditional American conservatism, what do you see in his campaign rhetoric that suggests there might be something there that conservatives can say, okay, I don't really necessarily like the guy, I hate what he says in public, and I hate the way he acts, but there's something there that people could vote for.
Well, I know lots and lots and lots and lots of people who would say what I just said, and then they would continue by saying, but I'm voting for him.
Right.
And the reason they say that is largely because they don't want the Democrats in control. They think in many respects that would be worse. And, when you talk about the rule of law and American constitutionalism, there are dark and very severe threats from that side. So I think that they would say, well, look, we look at his first term. And his first term, even though, he was on Twitter most of the time and saying outrageous things, there were things that happened that weren't bad. You can argue about whether the rates were right, but the tax reform, which was not all directed towards wealthy people, that is just a misnomer. It's not true.
That's a political talking point. Most middle-class people got, I think, the 8% tax cut.
And got one that was, my son got a much better tax cut than I did. But I think that they look at that and they say, well, it wasn't that bad. We can survive that. It wasn't that bad until the election. and his behavior after he lost, but he's not eligible to run again, so that won't happen. He did leave office at the end of the day, and so we'd rather have that than Harris. And I think that that's a perfectly reasonable conclusion to come to. My only qualification is that if you're going to vote for the lesser of two evils, you must accept the fact that your choice is an evil, right? You have to look at the downside and say, okay, I can live with the downside, but I recognize that it is a downside. And there are a lot of people that are doing that, and I think that there may be enough that Trump squeaks through.
Rick Esenberg, we'll take a break here. Lots more to talk about, including this question that sort of came to my mind. Are we seeing sort of the beginning phase of an era where we see the traditional two parties, Democrats and Republicans, sort of splinter and break off to where they actually have much different national elections? We'll ask Rick that question. And a few more. We got a great question about non-citizens voting. I think we should probably talk about that since that's front and center on most conservatives' minds. Let's take a break here. You're listening, of course, Political Power Hour, Thursday edition, legal edition, right here on 620 WTMJ.
Must be the season of the wind.
Thanks for tuning in on this Thursday edition, legal edition of Political Power Hour. We got a powerhouse guest today, Rick Esenberg, president of the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. So I asked this question, and I'm going to just lay out a scenario because, and I'm not predicting this because either of these two candidates could win. I don't think anybody who says they know what's going to happen is spouting nonsense. Let's say Trump loses. And that would be a blow for Republicans and certainly conservatives, even if they don't like everything about him. Do you think that could be the beginning of a splintering among Republican Party, that there actually is a group that says, we're not putting up with whatever you think conservative is. We love the Trump and now J.D. Vance version of that, and they sort of splinter off. Could we be at the beginning of something like that, where we actually see sort of a reformation of American politics?
Yeah, I should say, and should have said before the last section, that my opinions here are my own. They're not the opinions of the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. We don't take positions on candidates as an organization. But I would say that that's one possibility. There is this rift within conservatism. It is a lot of times the mainstream media talks about this as Trump being extreme right. He's not extreme right. He's something completely different. At least as right has been defined in America, in the post-war era. And so one possibility is the Republican Party would splinter. We had a dinner at Will we hosted Charles Murray in 2016. And he spoke at a luncheon that we hosted, and he said he thought that if Trump won the presidency in 2016, it would ultimately lead to the demise of the Republican Party. And that's as we know it, and that's possible.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of, these things take a long time, but we may be seeing the beginnings of all of that.
Right, but the second thing, I think the other way this might work out is you have to look at this from the historical perspective. I mean, populism is a recurrent thing in American politics, and it's usually some kind of response to the resentment of voters who feel that they're not listened to. And I do think that's some of what's going on today. But typically what happens is these populists, they do not become a new party, but one of the existing parties kind of assimilates their concerns into its party platform in some way. And I think that once the person of Donald Trump has passed from the scene, the kind of hard work of figuring out how that might happen may be what the Republican Party undertakes. And it emerges as something which is a little bit different than what we had prior to Trump, but directionally the same, taking into account the concern of the Trump voters. And the reason that happens is, given the way our system is set up, it's really hard to be a third party. I mean, you just, the geographic legislative districts, first past the post, it's just hard to do that. And so I think that the second scenario is probably the more likely one.
Yeah, I guess the answer to that would be, it's very hard to do it, but at some point there may be a time when that is sort of the experience Americans want, instead of having two choices.
My point is, systemically it's very hard, right, because it's very, very hard to get any kind of significant representation in Congress.
This one is for you if Trump wins. Do you think he understands the limitations of that office? As a candidate, do you think he understands what the limitations are? Because it doesn't seem like it, listening to what he says.
Well, I think he has sort of the instincts of, somebody who's run a business where, he would snap his fingers and things would get done. And I think it's sometimes hard for people like that to understand that the government doesn't work that way. I think that in his first term, he was largely restrained by people who did understand that, and by his need, I think, to retain the support of traditional conservatives. My concern is that in his second term, those people won't be there because those people, Mitch McConnell, Paul Ryan, Attorney General Barr, John Kelly, he wound up at odds with all of them, and they with him, and so. My concern is that there are going to be more loyalists. On the other hand, I have a hard time seeing Trump as this ominous and formidable authoritarian. I just don't think he's that serious. I think that if you do something to him that threatens his self-image, he gets very, very angry. And so losing was a big problem for him. But when it comes to just running the government, I think that he's not all that committed to any particular point of view. And this I think, benefits him because I think a lot of these voters that I was talking about before who don't like him, but are voting for him anyway, I think they believe sincerely that when he says, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that or I'm going to do the other thing, he doesn't really mean any of it. It's just talk and might even be talk which are designed to further his electoral strategy, which is basically to get out these low propensity voters who aren't going to vote unless the stakes and the reasons for voting are made very, very dramatic. They're eating your dog. They're eating your cats. You got to vote. I think that's an unfortunate development, but I think a lot of voters think that that's what's going on.
I think that's exactly right, and that's what I hear from the folks that I know that work on the campaign. It's getting those voters out to the polls, and sometimes that's the way you have to do it, very bombastic language that gets their attention, gets them out of their chairs, and gets them to the polling place. Real quick before the break, I'm going to talk about this legal question about non-citizens voting. Will we see record turnout, you think, next week? When all the votes are tallied, will we have a record turnout in Wisconsin?
Yes, I think so.
I think so, too. Rick Esenberg, president of the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, his comments about politics, not his organization's. Always enjoy the conversation with Rick Esenberg on the program. After the break, that constitutional question, a legal question as well, about non-citizens voting. Is that a reality, and do we already have laws in place to sort of handle that situation? All of that as we wrap up the Political Power Hour, Thursday edition right here on 620 WTMJ.
Got a black magic woman.
Oh, just for you on this Halloween. I don't wear a costume, and I don't really celebrate Halloween. I love for my grandkids, they candy the hell out of Halloween, so they're good for them, and hopefully they won't get cavities. We got about a minute and a half for Rick Esenberg joining us, Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, and a lot of people asked on the WTMJ Talk and Text line about this question about non-citizens voting. How realistic is it? And if it's already the law, which I think it is, why do we need more laws or more language?
Well, by statute, you can't vote in a national election. The Wisconsin Constitution, I think, properly interpreted, means that you can't vote in a state election, and I don't think a local election either. There are some people who argue otherwise, and I think that this amendment was designed to respond to that. I think that, like it or not, that's what it's there for. How do non-citizens vote in Wisconsin? Nobody really knows because there's no systematic way to prevent that from happening. If I had to guess, I'd guess some do, but not a great number.
Yeah. I think that's the right way to look at that. And you want to make a prediction? You think the question will pass on the ballot?
Yeah, I think it'll pass.
Yeah, okay. Rick Esenberg, always great to talk to you. Have a great time at Marquette. Say hi to all the lawyers over there.
I now say hi to your nephew.
Well, I appreciate that.